Okay, I'm recording this on Zoom because it just felt right for this class. Um, what I'll be talking about today is Navya Nyaya logic. Navya Nyaya logic is a logical system that was developed in India in the 13th century from a set of texts called the Nyaya Sutras. It expanded on them and created a whole logical system. And I'll get into all that a little bit later, but that's just a very brief overview of what we'll be talking about today. So my goals with how to present this information is to highlight the motivation for creating a logical system and how that can influence how the logical system turns out. A lot of people who study Western logic think it's sort of like the height and best logical system of all time, and there's really nothing that can compare. But in reality, different logical systems, depending on your perspective, could be considered equally as valid and useful. It's just dependent upon what the motivation of it was when it was created. So the modern logical system, the motivation was definitely around the sort of non-subject matter dependent and argument valid ideas, like what arguments are valid, and sort of removing the subject matter from them altogether. So that's the motivation for the Western logics, but then the motivation for Indian logic was entirely different. And that goes over my second goal with the presentation, which is to briefly go over those motivations for the Aristotelian logic, as well as briefly go over those motivations for the Navya Nyaya logics, and then also talk a little more about why those motivations were different and the consequences of those motivational differences. And then finally, I want to give a brief overview, and I want to specify and clarify, very brief. This system is massive. Navya Nyaya has been used for like 700 years now, and there's been a lot of people writing about it, and it's just incredibly complex and actually quite beautiful system as well once you get used to the major changes. So the motivations for Aristotelian logic, like I was saying before, where it came from. So logic in the form of Aristotelian logic can perhaps be traced back to ancient geometry. Ancient geometry was just sort of these observed facts about reality, where you measure one side of a triangle, another side of a triangle, and the third side, and then suddenly you find out, oh, this triangle has these qualities, and then you do it again and again and again and again until eventually you've measured a ton of different triangles, and then you write them all down in a book. So that's sort of the very, very ancient form of geometry. And well, actually, probably wouldn't be written down either. But then you move into the more modern age, I guess modern age, still like 2,500 years ago. And you get to these logical systems where they wanted to be able to derive new things from things that they already knew without having to use empirical methods to prove them. And sorry for the little noise in the background. That is this bird, Pepe. He's my mom's parrot. I've been looking over him for a little while now because my mom's out of town. So he might make a little bit of noise, but if he makes too much noise, I'll stop the presentation and continue back up when he quiets down a little bit. But he doesn't seem to be making too much noise right now. Just those weird, like sort of screeching noises. That's Pepe. So because Western logic has its roots in mathematics, it's innately tied to mathematics. And one of the key assumptions of mathematics is this universal logic system that can be applied to anything and should be applied to basically everything, where, if no matter who the person is, if you give everyone the same mathematical equation, they are going to give you the same result, assuming that they know how to use the math system, because the math system is very straightforward and it has this universal logic system. And that logic system was developed for that purpose. And it was for the purpose of geometry, for the purpose of arguments, for the purpose of validity. But one of the key functions of it, or I guess not functions, one of the key attributes of it was that it was subject matter independent. So it didn't matter what you were talking about, as long as you were talking about the argument at base. So you could be talking about clouds or dogs or parrots, but you can simplify them all down to, A's and B's, X's and Y's, things like that. That's sort of the idea, is that you're very much abstracting away from the real world. Once again, the motivation for that is simply to create a system where you can derive anything that's subject matter independent, as well as, say, the very coveted like good argument or good reasoning. What is good reasoning? That's a question that logic tries to answer, and tries to come to real conclusions through good reasoning, because the conclusions aren't they're not going to stand if the reasoning wasn't good at all. So moving on to some stuff about India and the motivations for Indian logic. Some stuff about India, but just a little bit of background knowledge that'll be really useful when I'm analyzing the motivations for the Indian logic, is that there's two main religions that were developed in India historically. And of course, there's also Jainism, but Hinduism and Buddhism are the major ones. And in Hinduism, there's a concept called moksha, which is the ending of this cyclical rebirth that occurs perhaps indefinitely, depends on your school of Buddhism or the Hinduism, but not necessarily indefinitely, but that's irrelevant. But the idea is that you don't want to be in this cycle anymore. You don't want to be constantly being rebirthed into the world, whether it be as God or in hell of some sort. You don't want that to occur anymore. So the way to prevent this from occurring is to remove from yourself all desire and all ignorance. However, some schools of Hinduism believe that desire and ignorance are actually the same thing. And so if you remove ignorance, you have also removed desire, because they believe that desire is just a person being ignorant of why they shouldn't desire something, right? So Buddhism has a very similar system where, the samsara of cyclical rebirth, you want to remove yourself from that. In Buddhism, or at least traditional Buddhism, it would be, no longer existing. It's not like you become a god of some sort. You just no longer exist. So this school of Buddhism that believe in this goal being lack of existence, they think that you can achieve that, and the other schools believe the goal is to achieve Buddhahood or whatever it is. They also believe that you achieve this goal through what's called right knowledge. So right knowledge is the way that you remove yourself from ignorance. So as I say on the slide, how to achieve, so goal, remove yourself from the cycle of rebirth. How to achieve this goal, remove yourself from ignorance. How to remove ignorance, right knowledge. What is right knowledge? Well, that's a big question. So what is right knowledge has been defined in a lot of different texts of Hinduism and Buddhism and just Indian philosophy in general. But there's one in particular that's quite relevant, which is the Nyaya Sutras, which are very much concerned with the idea of having a system in which you can derive proper knowledge. So it's all about what is right knowledge, how can you infer right knowledge, how can you acquire right knowledge, things of that sort, which is what I'll be talking about on this slide. So to give a little brief background about what the Nyaya Sutra is it's a very old book from India, and India had oral traditions, so it's very difficult to pin down an author and also pin down the dates. So it's got this 800-year gap in which it could have been written, sometime between 600 BCE and 200 CE. And it's actually mainly about epistemology. It's not actually mainly about logic. However, those two are very, very closely tied. in Hindu, or I guess Indian philosophy in general. The idea that, once again, it's you're trying to derive right knowledge. You're not just trying to derive valid knowledge. You're trying to make sure that it is right, that it is like true. Um, and because of this desire for right knowledge, there's a lot of information in the Nyaya Sutras about how you get this right knowledge, and the means of right knowledge in Indian philosophy come in 6 forms. However, only 4 of these forms are accepted by the Nyaya Sutra. So the 6 forms are pratyaksa, which is perception, anumana, which is inference, upamana, which is comparison and analogy, arthapata, which is derivation from circumstances, which is not one that's accepted, and anupalabdhi, which is a negative or cognitive proof. And then there's sabda, which is reliance on the words of others, especially experts. So the 4 of these that are accepted by the Nyaya Sutras is pratyaksa, which I said was perception, anumana is inference, upamana, comparison or analogy, and sabda, testimony of others. However, the main one of these that we will focus on is, of course, inference, because logic is all about deriving proper inferences. So how we derive these proper inferences is centrally important to the study of this logic that was created. So the one, once again, that I'll focus on is this anumana, or inference. And so the first books, first chapters, 32nd sutra reads as follows: the members of a proper anumana are proposition, reason, example, application, and conclusion. So an example of this would be proposition. This hill is fiery. Reason, because it is smoky. Example, whatever is smoky is fiery, such as a kitchen. Application, so this hill is smoky. Conclusion, this hill is fiery. So that is literally the full extent of everything that is in the Nyaya Sutras about formal logic systems, which is why the Navya Nyaya logical people, or people who created this logical system came along and really fleshed it out and created some formalizations. So the Navya Nyaya logical system is one that is the one that I will be going over. So what is the Navya Nyaya logic? The Navya Nyaya logic is a school of Indian logic that grew out of the Nyaya Sutras, which we were just talking about, and this search for right knowledge. I'm going to say that like a billion times because it's centrally important to how the system developed, because this system developed not just as a logic, but as an epistemic system as well, which is very different from how we deal with epistemic logic in Western philosophy. Because in Western philosophy, we're taking a logical system that already exists, like modality, and we're adapting it so that we can use it for epistemology. While in this case, what was really occurring was they were creating a new system to deal with epistemology, which is why the system has its major differences. And also one of the major motivations was to make the logical system consistent with traditional views. And because the traditional views did not always have long proofs and things like that that were supporting them, they simply changed the logical system so that it would support those views, which is incredibly fascinating because it just completely changes the goal of the system. And because of that, there's all these major differences. But a small disclaimer moving, well, actually, I suppose I should say The history of it was, once again, that it grew out of this Nyaya school, and it was founded in the 13th century by the philosopher Gengesa Upadhyaya. Yeah, I'm going to go with that, of Mithila. I've tried reading that so many times, but it's still just, I don't know. I don't know how to pronounce it. So anyway, so a small disclaimer about this logic is that it will kind of not seem like logic. And I'm not, there's a couple reasons why I think it could be that it doesn't feel like logic, and that's because the formality is less strict. Like it doesn't really use variables at all. It only, like, everything is pertained to the real world, or at least ideas, some sort of object, and an object is defined later on as, an idea or a thing or the absence of a thing. And I'll get into that later, but just sort of a small disclaimer is like, don't be alarmed if it doesn't seem like logic, because once again, it's used as a logical system. So to sort of move forwards into how I'm going to attack this logical system, I'm first going to talk about, once again, so the system, like, so tied in with epistemology that you can't really rip them apart. So you have to start with the epistemological beliefs of the people who designed it, which are the Navya and Nyaya. So you have to start out with this idea of what is knowledge, and then you have to move into the acquisition of knowledge. And then finally, you wind up at the system for this acquisition of knowledge. And then you get some variables, but they're not really variables in the way that we would think of them. And then I'm just going to finish off with a couple, I guess, one really interesting idea that is derived from this system. So starting out with knowledge, there are two forms of knowledge in the world in this system. There is indeterminate knowledge, which just refers to the knowledge of something's existence. But you don't have the knowledge of how that thing is differentiated from other things. So you don't have an idea of how it's categorized, you just know that it exists. So an example would be, seeing like a pot in front of you. That, for some reason, all the sources I found either use like pots or like souls as examples. So you're going to see that a lot. So if a pot is sitting in front of you, you have indeterminate knowledge of it if you have no idea what a pot is, what defines a pot, or this like potness, the nature of pots. You don't know what a pot is, but you can see the pot sitting in front of you. So you can see this thing sitting in front of you. You know it's there, but you don't know that it's a pot. So then determinate knowledge is, it occurs when you have three forms of knowledge. You have this indeterminate knowledge of the thing sitting in front of you, which you'll later know is a pot. And second is the indeterminate knowledge of what this potness nature is. So what defines a pot as a pot? It's always referenced with ness. I'm not sure if that's normal for epistemology or whether it's unique to this system, but it's potness. So the generic character of all pots. So you don't really know what a pot is, but you have indeterminate knowledge of what categorizes a pot. And then you see a pot in front of you. So now you have those two indeterminate knowledges of what's sitting in front of you and what defines a pot. And then the third thing is knowledge that the thing in front of me has the differentiating factor, that general character of all pots. So these three knowledges come together. This thing that's sitting in front of you, you now know has the differentiating character that defines the pot. So now you know it's a pot. So now you're able to say, this is a pot. It's a lot of information to try to just say this is a pot. But anyway, so furthermore, determinate knowledge is defined as the knowledge of the relation between what's called the quantificand and, or sorry, not qualificand and the qualifier. So the qualificand in this case is the pot. So it's thing that's receiving the qualifier of potness. And then the qualifier is that idea of potness. So once you have this determinate knowledge, like I said before, you're now able to name it. And since naming is a type of inference, you're making the inference that this thing is this previous thing that you know. That's sort of a very large thing that you can do. So how is it then that you are able to make that assumption that the pot in front of you has this generic character potness? How are you able to make that connection? So the main answer to that question is, how do you get knowledge from other knowledge, right? So there's this idea that one thing will pervade another. That's it's different than the material conditional in a couple ways, but I think that'll become fairly obvious when I define pervasion and get into a couple examples. So when object A pervades object B, all of the loci of B are the loci of A, but not necessarily are all of the loci of A loci of B. So an example of this, at least according to 13th century people in India with the metaphysical beliefs of the Indian philosophy to which they subscribed, fire pervades smoke, but smoke does not pervade fire. So, for example, everywhere where there is smoke, there has to be fire, but everywhere where there is fire, there does not necessarily have to be smoke. So, the way to do that would be like a burning hot piece of iron doesn't produce smoke, but smoke is not produced by anything other than fire. So what this loci is, or these locus, a locus or multiple loci, is an object or idea. So it's like a single pinpoint. If you have like a circle of an object, it has multiple loci inside of it, but it has one central idea around it that forms this circle, and that can be pervaded by something else that's larger than it because it fits inside of it. So a locus or loci is this object or idea. And furthermore, to get into a little bit of how this interplays with mathematics, is 50 rupees is pervaded by 100 rupees, but 50 rupees is not necessarily but 100 rupees is not necessarily pervaded by 50 rupees. So when you have 50 rupees, you don't know whether you have 100 rupees yet, because, saying you have 50 rupees means you could have 80 or whatever, 200, but saying you have 100 rupees, you know you have 50 rupees. So 100 rupees pervades 50 rupees. So this idea of distinguishability, it's quite a difficult task to distinguish one item from another, especially from the standpoint of a philosopher, where, it's like, are you an essentialist or are you an existentialist for objects? There's a lot of questions that arise here. So distinguishing one object from another in this philosophy occurs from what is called inherence. So types of objects have entities inhered in them and entities in which they are inhered. This categorization is how all distinguishment is accomplished here. However, no object can inhere a universal. So that's sort of the classic way of putting it. But inherence just means it's like a component. It's a necessary component of something. So if you have like a pot, the necessary components are the two halves of the pot, if you were to break it into two halves, that is. So these objects come together to create what it is, and they are inhered to that object. But what about this concept of no object is able to inhere a universal? That's sort of a very interesting thing to say. And once again, this doesn't feel like logic all that much, but it's sort of developing a system in which you can say certain things about reality. And that's how they defined logic, is like, if it allows you to produce additional knowledge, then it is a logic. So in this case, if we take the universal like blueness, for example. Blueness, this is also quite a classic example. Blueness is it's a universal because it's a concept that is applied like basically everywhere. Anything could turn blue. It's like it's just a concept because it's blueness, but it inheres a quality of objects. So how universals are connected to objects is through this chain where universals inhere qualities and qualities inhere in objects. So the universal never inheres in an object because there's this connection in between with a quality. So the universal is blueness, the quality is blue, and the pot could be inhered with blue. So the blue inheres in the pot, and then you have a blue pot to put it into sort of English, normal English terms. So that's sort of this idea of universals, and it's quite a fascinating topic. But furthermore, to give it a better example, and this is a direct quote out of Burton's article that I think will make it a little bit more clear because he's a little more well spoken than I am, having studied it for more than 20 years. The universal blueness inheres in a quality, blue, which is a particular shade of the color. Qualities inhere in substances. A particular shade of blue may inhere in a pot, for example. A pot is a compound substance composed of smaller parts. A pot inheres in each of those pots, all of the way down to the atomic substances which make them up. And those atomic substances inhere in nothing. So that's this idea of inherence, and that's how you distinguish one thing from another. But it's also one way that two things can be related is one is inhered in another. Which is very similar to saying that one thing pervades another. So then we have this other concept of absence, which can further distinguish two things. So all cognitions, all thoughts, must have some content connected with them, right? So this comes out of the idea, which was very popular in ancient India, that like, oh, you say, think of a new color, you can't, right? So all cognition must be connected to some sort of content in the real world. And therefore, if we are to think about the absence of something, so if we think about the lack of a pot sitting on the ground, it is actually that absence is an entity with content, which is very important, and that it is included in many, many proofs. And once again, these proofs are very informal. They're not like all variables like our proofs. So some of the things I've even said so far count as proofs. So the blueness, not the blueness, sorry, the absence is an entity with content, and it's almost a physical object. So when you don't have a pot, you have something. You have the absence of a pot. Therefore, this is like a universal assumption that the lack of an object is an object. And it's oftentimes referred to as the counterpositive of blankness. So like the counterpositive of potness is the lack of a pot. So anywhere on a ground where there is not a pot, you can say that that piece of ground is inhered by the counterpositive of potness, which is pretty substantial when you think about it. So one of the major differences between Western logic and this logic is this idea of which direction or in which direction you're abstracting. So in our logic, we abstract all the way out of objects so that it's completely subject matter independent, and we could be talking about anything, like I said before. And we take these specific examples and we make them into general statements in order to analyze the argument without the words as a distraction to us. So, we take, if the grass is green, then it must have rained in the past 2 weeks, and the grass is green, therefore it rained in the past 2 weeks, we would simplify that into, if A then B, and A, therefore B. So we're abstracting all the way out of the objects so that we can analyze just the argument. However, in this system of Navya and Nyaya, we're abstracting into the objects, which is really surprisingly hard to understand what the difference is, but it is quite a substantial difference. So when we take specific examples and we come to conclusion about that example, that's all we've done, is we've come to the conclusion about that example. It's not saying that we've come to a conclusion about anything else other than that example, which is fascinating. So when you talk about potness and you're able to conclude something about potness, all that you have now is a conclusion about potness. Even if that structure of the argument was valid, it's not considered right knowledge if you just substitute the word pot for everything and you push it somewhere else, because that wouldn't make sense, because potness has its own unique characteristics that can only work in the proof. So it's very tied to reality. And all the articles that I read were constantly saying in them, like, this logic is tied to reality. They were extreme realists. And they believed, of course, that conclusions about real objects are just conclusions about real objects, which is a fascinating difference in the logics themselves. So another way to say this, as Molick put it, is an implication holds by virtue of the meaning content of propositions rather than their truth values. And this must itself be part of the concepts they contain. So meaning content rather than truth values. Variables and really variables have these truth values tied to them. When you have if A then B, you give them different truth values, and then the statement has a total truth value. But in the context of Navya and Nyaya, this meaning content is very important. So when you're talking about souls, the meaning of a soul is centrally important to the argument that you're making, which is why a lot of people sometimes actually argue that it's not a logic at all, which was somewhat disappointing to read when I was doing my research. But some people don't consider it a logic at all. But anyway, so this system is no longer based on truth values. It's based on meaning content, which is incredibly different. And sort of the reason behind this, like I've sort of hinted to before, is that you're searching for this right knowledge. You're not searching for valid arguments. You're not searching for a valid conclusion from a set of propositions. You're searching for the right propositions that lead to the right conclusion. So it doesn't make sense to have an argument so far abstracted that you're no longer talking about objects. It's just not something that the system was concerned about. So that's where the motivation came from. It's the search for right knowledge. Like I said, I've come back to it. I said I would come back to it. I'm coming back to it hard. So this search for right knowledge, incredibly important and central to the entire system. So an example of a proof in this system, and once again, really doesn't look anything like the proofs we've done, which is why it's really kind of hard to explain it in the sense of a proof that we know and love. So one is the thesis, and this was exactly what I was saying quite a while ago. The Nyaya Sutras, I think I said it all the way back here. No? Yes, here. The members of a proper anumana are proposition, reason, example, application, and conclusion. If we go all the way back here, what we can see is a very, very similar system. It's just translated slightly different, which is thesis, reason, statement of pervasion and examples, application, and conclusion. So in this case, what we're trying to prove, the thesis up here, is word is non-eternal. So like the spoken word is non-eternal. And the reason is because it possesses the property of being produced. So as humans, we produce the word. And this is important, like this proof is centrally important to a few ideas behind both, actually, particularly Buddhism, but also a little bit in Hinduism, where one of the central ideas is that the Dharma, which is like the word of the Buddha, which will allow you to achieve cessation from samsara, that degrades over time, and eventually you get to a point at which you can no longer achieve this cessation because we're so far away from when the Buddha actually lived. So that idea in Buddhism is sort of proven here, where word is non-eternal. Because another idea from other scholars at the time was that the word of the Buddha should be eternal because it's just one person passing it from one person to another, right? So theoretically, it like shouldn't break down. But this is saying word is not eternal, and the reason is because it possesses the property of being produced. So it has being producedness. The statement of pervasion and examples. What possesses the property of being produced is seen to be non-eternal, such as a pot. So that the first bit of that was the statement of pervasion. What possesses the property of being produced is seen to be non-eternal. So everything that has been produced is non-eternal. That's a pervasion there, and that allows us to draw the conclusion later on. And then the example, the like positive example, is such as a pot. A pot is non-eternal because it was produced by a potter. And then it goes on to say what possesses the property of not being produced is seen to be eternal, such as the soul. So sort of the Western like first thought here is like, what do you mean? We had a beginning, we were born at some point. Of course, in Hindu and Buddhist beliefs, time, well, actually, it depends on the school, of course, but some of them believe that time is eternal and our soul has existed the entire time, all the way back, like indefinitely. And because of that, the soul is eternal. It was never really created. Some systems believe in like a cyclical world where the world is destroyed and then recreated, but the souls are never changed, so the souls never have a beginning or an end. Others simply believe that the soul was created at some point, but those are not relevant to this proof. So what possesses the property of not being produced is seen to be eternal, such as the soul. Application, word is like this, i.e. it possesses the property of being produced. Therefore, word is non-eternal. So we're combining this pervasion with something that we think has the property that we said was pervaded. So it must land somewhere within that circle. The loci of the word must land within the loci of non-eternal because it was produced, because it has this attribute of producedness. So further analyzing this, to just sort of put it into the formal terms of how it's normally analyzed within the system, is that the loci are word, pot, and soul. Those are the three loci that are being explicitly mentioned in this proof. Although, of course, there are many loci within word, and there are many loci within pot and many within soul. Well, actually, soul is a sketchy one. People disagree on that, so I'm not going to make a statement about that. But many loci exist within word and pot, but individually, they are individual loci. So the word is a loci, the pot is a loci, and the soul is a loci. So the word is what's called the paksa locus, which means that it is the locus which we are trying to reach a conclusion about, or about which we are trying to reach a conclusion. So once again, in this example is the word because we're trying to prove that the word was non-eternal. Pot is called the sapaksa locus, which means that it is the example which has likeness to the paksa locus. So it is the thing that we use as an example to say this is similar to the thing that we're trying to prove about, which is the paksa locus. So then the soul in this case is the vipaksa, which means it is the locus which bears the anti-likeness per se to the paksa locus. So it is the thing which is not similar to the thing that we're trying to prove something about. And therefore the qualities of that thing which is different than the thing we're trying to prove must not be the qualities of the thing about which we're trying to prove. And this idea can only really exist in pervasion, because according to Western logic, it's a little bit backwards, right? So we're saying this thing that we're trying to prove something about is like, it exists, right? We're trying to prove something about, we're trying to say it's non-eternal, and then this other thing exists, which bears no likeness to it. Therefore, the qualities of this thing that bears no likeness to it must not exist within the original thing that we were trying to prove, which is the Baksa locus, which that doesn't really make sense, because we didn't like initially say there was a connection between those two. However, I'll go over that a little bit more at the end when I talk about like, how is this logic? Like, is this not just examples? And because it's a little bit like, I'm laying a lot down here and I want to like give it a second. So I'll go over that problem a little bit later on. So then the locates, which are just another sort of name for a part of the argument, are the properties of being eternal, being produced, not being eternal, and not being produced. So once again, the absence is in fact a property. So not being eternal is as much a property as being eternal is, like I said before. So not being eternal is called the sadhya locati, meaning it's the property which we are trying to prove about the paksa locus. So that's just like a term that should be like kept in mind. So then how are these, like I said before, loci and locates? I just pointed at my screen. Oh no, no one can see me point. Okay, the loci and the locates, how are they connected? Because it's not entirely obvious. It says like they're the properties of being eternal, and the loci somehow have those properties, but it's not entirely like explicitly said how they're actually connected. So the locus limits the locate, because the locate is just a property, which means it could belong to anything. But the idea here is that the locate might mean something different when it's being applied to, let's say, a pot versus a soul. Once again, pots and souls all day. So it might mean something different when you're referring to a pot than it will when you're referring to a soul. So you have to limit this locate because it's so broad, like anything could have this property. So it's so broad that you have to limit it to just the locus that you're talking about, which is, once again, like I said before, where this realism is coming in, this extreme realism, because it's only connected to this object, to this one locus that you're talking about. So the locus limits the locate to speaking about just it. So a quality is limited only to the locus which it describes and is inhered in, which is sort of the better way of putting it than I did. And the exact quote is, the eternalness of a given soul is not universal eternalness, and is not equivalent to the eternalness of a separate entity. So like what I said, different entities might have different like they might have the same property, but it might operate differently under different circumstances, which doesn't really work for our type of logic, because we're saying that there's, I guess you could call it proper substitution, where you can substitute the same thing in as long as it's substituted for the same variable and things like that. So it's like substituting in a random idea into an argument. Actually, I don't know if that's proper. Yeah, proper substitution. So you're substituting like a different idea into the same argument, and that doesn't work here, because it's limited, which is, once again, incredibly different, but it also produces some very interesting results. And it also helps deal with the idea that absence of an object is an object. Because when there's no pot on the ground, like I was saying before, the absence delimited by potness adheres to the ground. So this is saying the ground is an owner of something which has the potness quality that is limited by the absence operator. So it's saying something that doesn't exist is that something, it's a little hard, something that doesn't exist that is like a pot is sitting on the ground right there. And you can do that for anything. So you're making these like sort of wild claims about reality because you're using the absence operator. And a key point of it is that you can never get rid of the absence operator once it's in an argument. So once you put the absence argument in, you can sort of just create stuff. But it doesn't say anything really. Well, I guess that sort of goes against what I said, but it says something substantial, but it doesn't say anything that will interfere with things that exist, I suppose is the way to put it. So when you have the absence operator on it, it will say something substantial. It'll say this thing exists, but it will not say anything about how that absence of something interacts with things that do exist, if that makes sense. Which is why you're able to create things with an absence operator. So this is what I was saying back here maybe. I was saying it definitely somewhere, where if these examples are always used, like how is this logic at all, right? Because what you're doing is you're creating like just an argument for a single item, right? It's not really like, it doesn't mean anything to anything else. However, if you remember, the objects, like I was saying before, can have many loci within them. So if you're making a statement about potness, you're also making a statement about the halves of the pots and the atoms that make up the pots. So this likeness operator, or I guess not really an operator, this idea of I think that's supposed to be many people think likeness and unlikeness are questionable concepts to bring into logic. But anyway, this idea that you can have likeness. So something that is similar enough to something else can be used in the place of that other thing, which is, once again, very different than the assumptions that we bring into Western logic. And also it has another problem of, which is very difficult to define, of what is like to something else and what is unlike to something else. But I said this a very long time ago, which is why I'm excited to bring it back in right here. This system was designed to be used for traditional values. So traditional values, there's a whole metaphysics system already set up that the people subscribe to. So why would you try to mess with that? They already have this metaphysics system where, they have like a really long list of like most things, and they say these things are like to other things. And or they sometimes say like, oh, whatever generally seems like it's like to something else is like to something else. They make statements like that, and then they try to prove them in different ways. So likeness is sort of a big problem. But like I said, they allowed this problem to exist because it allows this system to be compatible with traditional values. Whereas if this system was not dependent upon likeness and unlikeness, then you could start to prove the traditional values incorrect. So you could use, a proof in Western logic to say that a soul has no likeness at all to another object which had no creation. And you could do that through a few different methods. You could at least try to do it. And I know of a few people, a few examples of people doing things like that I was reading about. I didn't include them because they're incredibly complex, once again, I said this is like a beautiful, really complex system, only brief overview. But so they allowed this likeness to exist, this likeness system, because it's compatible with the traditional values. I've said that like 5 times now, and I keep like over saying things, but that's why it exists. So I wouldn't really view it as a problem as much as a feature, because if this kind of thing existed in our logics, people would view it as a problem, which is why this like very different mindset comes to mind about how to look at other logics. So before I conclude with the sources, that's sort of what I want, you know, John, who's sitting here at the bar with me, who we took philosophy 296 together 10 years ago. That's what I want him to take away, is that, you know, our logic system that we use in this 296 or 416 class, it's not the only system. There's other systems out there that have been designed for other reasons, and people who have different belief systems than we do will subscribe to other logical systems. So there's no reason to have like an overly large amount of pride in our logical system, and there's also no reason to not doubt it, because a lot of people are like, oh, it's logical, you can't disagree with this. Yes, you can. You can disagree with logical things. There's a lot of really weird proofs out there that like say really odd things about reality, and you can disagree with them because you could subscribe to a different logical system. I don't think that people have to think that other people are wrong when it comes to logic. I think that people can accept other systems and see that in those other systems, people may come to different conclusions. So anyway, that's my sort of push at the end there for acceptance of other logical beliefs. But that should about conclude what I had to say about this. So some of my sources were the Nyaya Sutras, of course. I read all the relevant parts of the Nyaya Sutras. I didn't read all of them because it's quite long, especially when you read it with the commentary. Without the commentary, it's actually super short, and you could read through it very quickly, but it would mean nothing to you. Or I guess I shouldn't say you, because I don't know who I'm talking to, but it would mean very little to most people. And then I also used History of Indian Philosophy Part 1. I was recommended this book. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Lopez. I was also suggested towards Indian Logic, a reader by him. He's been a very helpful resource along my way of sort of understanding some of the Buddhist and Hindu beliefs that I've been talking about. And, once again, I don't want to claim to be any sort of an expert on the ideas of Buddhism or Hinduism, incredibly complex religions that, I have a very brief understanding of. So I don't mean to, say anything as fact about those religions. And then these last two were incredibly useful as well, especially materials for the study of Navya and Nyaya logic. I read through almost all of that book just and took notes on it just to sort of understand the basics of the system. And then diagrams for Navya and Nyaya by Jim Burton is where I got a lot of my examples, because his article just had really, really nice examples in it that allowed for very smooth transition from topic to topic in it. So anyway, thank you for listening to my probably too long presentation, but I hope you learned something, or I don't know, maybe you didn't, but I hope you did, and I hope you enjoyed it. So have a nice day.